Um, my message today is actually pretty simple. I have about 5 points to cover. The first point here is there's no single story of race experience. And I want to offer 3 anecdotes to illustrate that point. Around 2006 and 7, when Barry and I just started to do our research about Zambia, we met a Zambian person in Shanghai, and he was engaged in doing property evaluation. And he's lived in Shanghai for about 2 years. And prior to his experience in Shanghai, he worked in London, etc. So we were asking about his experience in Shanghai and how is that different maybe from his experience in London. And he gave us one example. He said, here in Shanghai, sometimes I hear people talking, whispering to each other when I was present, and people might say, "Hey, Gui." And upon hearing that, he said, I could turn sometimes, if I'm in the mood, I would turn back and talk back to them. And I'll say that if you call me Hei Gui, how about I call you Huang Gui? And then usually he said people around him would be surprised and then burst out laughing. And then he might engage them to give them some talk about experiences, etc. So he said, in Shanghai, sometimes I can play a role of being an educator. I'll tell people what's it like to be a Black person. But he said in London, I could never do that. And I wouldn't dare to do that. So that's interesting. Here in this one story, already you hear there's not a single story. His experiences in London, his experience in Shanghai may be different. There's also, in our research in Zambia, we have also encountered Chinese who have been in Zambia since 1990s. Now, these are early migrants into the country. And sometimes they would compare their experiences in 1990s Zambia. And they would say, sometimes our car got stuck in the road. And those days, people were so friendly, and they would come out voluntarily without asking for anything back to help us get the car out of the road, out of the stuckness. And this for them is very positive, and they would comment on how things have changed and how people have changed. Keep in mind Zambia, which I will touch on in a bit, how Zambia had waged anti-Chinese campaign since 2006. And the third anecdote I want to talk about is how there's a Zambian engineer who worked for a Chinese company in Zambia. And because his importance and his value to the Chinese company, he was sent also to China, to visit the headquarters, to do what? And then he traveled a little bit in China on his own. He actually even visited some villages. And he told me that in some villages he visited, people have never seen a Black person before. And they want to touch him, and they want to see, what is it like to have Black skin? And I asked him, do you think this is racism? He said, no, I don't think it's racism. I think this is ignorance. So I'm giving you those anecdotes to illustrate the point that there's no single story of race experience. And even in the third anecdote, when the Zambian engineer was talking about ignorance, in fact, the very use of the word ignorance exposes the fact that race is not a natural category. For some Chinese villagers who have never seen a Black person, have not experienced race in that sense, upon seeing a Black person, the race does not yet make any sense to them. Perhaps, it doesn't come to them naturally. It's not a natural category. So therefore, to enter a racial category or to be raised implies racialization, and that is a social political process. And this is something that I've seen Jamie and Roberto citing Jamie also in both of the articles, they have emphasized quite a bit that our focus need to be actually on racialization process itself. So that's point number one. There's no single story of race experience. My second point is there's no single history of racialization. And the processes of racialization are very much embedded in the very specific political economic contexts. And here I'll talk about China and Zambia. In the case of China, and people who do China studies know this already, but I'm just going to give you a little bit my take on this as well. So China began to experience racial thinking in late 19th century. And Chinese experience with racial thinking is actually very closely linked with how the world is worded for these people. So the racial thinking itself is linked with how the world becomes a word, how the word has become understood by certain people at the time. So racial thinking does not have a continuous presence in China, which I will talk about. I'm going to compare in different historical periods, racial thinking appears and disappears. So in late 19th century to early 20th century, some elites in China, get into what they call enlightenment. And for them, the enlightenment involves rewording of the world, right? And that enlightenment, part of that enlightenment is to accept and to embrace, at the time, the kinds of racial ideology that's circulating globally. So that is the racialization of the world. And that included also certain kind of racial anxiety and racial insecurity about Chinese presence in the world. So that's basically, that's sort of the beginning of what's so-called neo-modern enlightenment period in China. But in the first half of China and towards first half of 20th century of China, you have also is Chinese Revolution. Starting from Chinese Revolution, which I'm talking about is the Communist Party-led Chinese Revolution, and extending to the Mao period, the word is reworded again in a way, right? The discourse of class has taken a central place. And in that process, what you have witnessed is a disappearance of race. That race it's basically disappeared from public discourse. And there's no longer, what individuals may still have racial thinking. However, there's no longer a social discourse about race. And there's no racial anxiety or insecurity, at least not the same one as what emerged in late 19th centuries. And then fast forwarding to the reform and opening period. And now again, we're experiencing a new relationship with the world. In Chinese, it's called 接轨, right? Getting on track with the world. So in a way that involved in this getting on track is also the new understanding of development. And this time is to have China placed in a global market. And in that process, stages of development or different levels of development are linked with different levels of Suture, which is is a Chinese, but it's not just Chinese. It's actually circulated in Northeast Asia in the 19th century. The discourse of Suture, quality. So development is matched with or is interpreted through the lens of Suture, quality. The word is, as I said, the word is reworded again. And here you have the emergence of racial thinking within the Chinese society, linked with the question of development. And along with it also, it's not just the emergence of racial thinking, there is also representization of Chinese Chinese people who work in the countryside, because keep in mind that Chinese countryside experience collectivization. To restore small peasant production in the reform period is a process of representization in the countryside. So in a way that this representization is also to regard the peasantry as being backward, regarding the countryside as being somehow unmodern, pre-modern. Along with it also, there's a gender, there's re-feminization of Chinese women. So Chinese women as seen not feminine enough. Therefore, the reform process is partly about regaining feminization of Chinese women. So along with it, the rewarding of the world engages in different levels and different dimensions, and the racial thinking is part of that. So what you see here is that in the reform and opening period, we observe a tension. The tension here is the Chinese government still continues, Chinese national government still continues with the discourse of solidarity, which has legacy from the Mao period. However, within Chinese society, there are many in the Chinese society are having their own racial learning through personal experiences sometimes, but more often through Hollywood movies, internet, now emerging Weibo and WeChat, etc. And that's Lan Shanxian is using that word, racial learning. And with the racial learning, there's of course, alongside with is also racial thinking. So in the case of China then, even for one country, there's not single history, that history is not continuous. So that's what I was trying to get at, right? That racial thinking does not have a continuous presence in Chinese society. And now come to Zambia. I focus on how Chinese are being racialized in Zambia. Very quickly, Zambia experienced neoliberal policies, implemented neoliberal policies in 1990s that entails privatization of state assets, especially copper. And ordinary people in Zambia experience in that process great sense of insecurity, precarity, etc. Now, Chinese are coming to Zambia in this context as new foreign presence. And to some extent, the Chinese are seen by Zambian population, which the majority of which now feel greatly insecure, as unqualified expats. Therefore, the white people are seen as expats, conventional expats, but Chinese are unqualified expats. They are sort of like expats, but not quite, because Chinese don't speak good English and they don't appear to be upper class people. Most often, they may dressed up and they may be dressed, just like workers. That is Chinese managers and engineers. So it has been complained that even for Chinese engineers and bosses, they don't look like expats. So starting from 2006, Patriotic Front at the time was in opposition party. They started campaign, anti-Asian campaign initially, and then switched to focusing on anti-Chinese campaign. So in public media, newspapers, radios, you have daily berating of Chinese presence. There's hate speech against Chinese, calling them invaders, calling them infestors, not just investors with V, but infestors with F. And that coincided with the global, coming mostly from the West, the China threat discourse, drummed up mostly in the media, coming from the US, UK, etc. And which is regurgitating much of the yellow peril discourse that has surfaced in the 19th century. So what's interesting here is when Michael Sata, the leader of the Patriotic Front, won the election, that's when Chinese got into great anxiety because Michael Sata had threatened to expel the Chinese. So many Chinese were thinking about leaving the country. Now, at this point, Chinese ambassador, Mr. Zhou Yuxiao at the time, he made sure that he got the letter very, very, very quickly from the Chinese central government, and he made sure that he was the first to congratulate Michael Sata on his presidency. Now, that's interesting. Why would he do that? Now, Michael Sata, with the efforts of Chinese ambassador and also Chinese community leaders, actually made a U-turn. He totally turned back on his own previous attitudes toward Chinese. And he even joked that previously the MMD, the previous ruling party, they had their Chinese. Now I have my Chinese. Of course, not to say that things all got rosy after that, because the anti-Chinese campaigns still had legacy, still had social impact, and those impact is not going to go away for some time at least. But here, what we can observe here is how Patriotic Front, especially Michael Suture, is engaged what may be called strategic racialization. And even though he mobilizes yellow peril discourses, his mobilization is still different for different kinds of purpose, perhaps, from the yellow peril discourse in the US. Because in the US, yellow peril discourse has resulted in actual Chinese Exclusion Act in the past, in the 19th century, 20th century, and then today, almost a new Cold War. So Chinese ambassador probably had insight about, Suture, Michael Suter's practice of strategic racialization. Now I'm coming to my third point, is why is it important to talk about there's no single history? The whole purpose to talk about it is to de-essentialize racialization. To see actual racialization in the case of, as I used the example, yellow peril in the US and in Zambia, they're different. So also how Africans are racialized by people in China also is different from Africans are being racialized in the UK and the US, as the anecdotes I told earlier. To understand that there's no single history of racialization is for us to look for points of strategic intervention. And perhaps there's something we can learn here from the tactic or the strategy of the Chinese ambassador, Mr. Zhou Yuxiao, of how he engaged Mr. Suture, which helped Suture to make a U-turn. Now I'm come to my fourth point. We have to observe that there are some kind of common features here between Chinese in Africa and Africans in China. In this case, I'm talking about Africans in China and Chinese in Zambia specifically. The points, some common features here is both sides, when they engage in racialization, there is a perception of invasion, infesting, and threat. There is, on both sides, they engage in perceptions of privilege. That is, they presume Chinese, sometimes they actually imagine that Africans in China are more privileged. Just as in Zambia, some Zambians imagine that Chinese in Zambia are much more privileged. And that's, when you look at it, it's like a mirror image, very, very similar. And there's also racial profiling by local policemen in both countries. In China, people already know the story, but in Zambia, very similar. That is, a lot of Chinese, some Chinese are randomly, racially profiled by local policemen. So many Africans in China, especially SME entrepreneurs, and many Chinese in Africa, mostly workers, and also SMEs, small, medium-sized entrepreneurs, they share similar positions of precarity. That's point number 4. And the final point here is that about 180 countries have signed on the International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. That's including China and almost all African countries. So what I want to propose here is that China and African countries need to engage in anti-racism education, not race education, because we do not want to essentialize a race at all. And do not want to naturalize the category of race at all, but anti-racism education and anti-racism legislation as well in China and in African countries. And I think these are very important objectives to achieve for us to combat racism and racialization in both continents. Thank you.